Lecture 18, Collapse of the Carolingian Empire.
Welcome back. In the last lecture, we examined the Viking attacks on the Carolingian Empire during the 9th and the 10th centuries. And in this lecture, we're going to begin to consider some of the consequences of these attacks for the Carolingians themselves. And we're going to focus our attention on an especially crucial period of time, stretching from 814, the year in which Charlemagne died, until 843, the year in which some of Charlemagne's grandchildren signed a treaty known as the Treaty of Verdun, a document that has been called with some justification the birth certificate of Europe. And while the Treaty of Verdun does indeed give a rather distinctive shape to Europe for centuries to come, it can also be regarded in some ways as marking the death certificate of the Carolingians, even if it would take some time for the Carolingian dynasty to be deposed in the various parts of the Carolingian world. The switch from success to disaster occurred really quite quickly for the Carolingians. In the 8th century, during the time of Charles Martel and Pepin the Short and Charlemagne, the Carolingians had succeeded in imposing their rule on the Franks, and the Franks had succeeded in expanding at the expense of their neighbors. But in the 9th century, the opposite was occurring. Outsiders were succeeding in invading the Carolingian Empire, and the Carolingians were going to start to lose control of the territories they had seemed to rule so firmly just a century earlier. And there are two main reasons why the Carolingians' luck runs out in the 9th century. One reason is military. One of the reasons why the Franks were so successful militarily in the 8th century appears to be the appearance of the knight in Europe, and that Franks were able to harness knights and this new way of knightly fighting for their own benefit. People had fought on horseback before the 8th century, certainly, but they were limited in the techniques they could use to attack enemies from the backs of their horses. You might wield a spear while sitting on horseback, but if you had a spear, all you could do was to jab overhand or underhand at someone, or perhaps throw the spear some 30 or 40 yards at your enemy. The one thing you could not do was you could not take the spear and tuck it under your arm and then charge at an enemy with the full weight of you and your horse behind it. If you attempted to do this, you would certainly have shattered the spear, you would have flown off the back of your horse and probably killed yourself with this maneuver. Knights were individuals who were able to fight in the manner I just described. They are able to take a very heavy type of spear or a lance, and they are able to tuck it under their arm, or couch it, to use the technical term. They are able to point themselves at an enemy and ride into the enemy with the full weight of themselves, the horse, and the armor they wear behind it. To be struck by a charging knight was something you did not want to experience. And it would appear that two technological developments during the course of the 8th century allowed some European warriors to start to fight as knights. One was the appearance of the stirrup in Europe, which probably comes from Central Asia. Stirrups, which you could place your feet into on either side of the horse, gave the rider more stability and more control over the horse, allowed you to wear heavier armor without worrying about falling off the horse if you leaned too far to one side or the other. The other technological development was the appearance of the high-backed saddle. The high-backed saddle would rise up behind the rider so that when you struck someone charging with a lance, you didn't get thrown off your horse backwards. You received a rather jarring experience on your posterior, but at least you were still on your horse. There's been a lot of controversy as to when stirrups arrived in Europe and when people started to fight like knights. And the most recent research suggests that the transition to knightly fighting took longer than previous generations of scholars thought, perhaps due to the inherent conservatism of warriors who were suspicious of new ways of fighting. After all, you were alive thanks to the old ways of fighting. It took centuries before the use of the stirrup on the high-back saddle and the wearing of heavy armor and couching your lance became commonplace. But the switch does seem to start in the 8th and the 9th centuries, and Franks do seem to have employed knights against their enemies. Against the Vikings and their longboats, however, knights were not much use. You couldn't ride out into the middle of a river on the back of a horse, and in this sense, the Carolingians' luck runs out. The other important element of Carolingian success was dynastic luck. The Carolingians, like the Merovingians before them, divided up their kingdom, or even their empire, among various male sons when the last Carolingian ruler had died. It just so happened, however, that between the time of Pepin the Short, who was the first king of the Franks, and Charlemagne, this had not been a problem for the Carolingians, thanks to several lucky developments. When Pepin the Short died in 768, he has two sons, one of whom dies quickly, Carloman, in 771. So the succession is not contested in a civil war. Charlemagne had a very long reign. He does not die until 814. And towards the end of his life, it looked as though there might be a problem with the succession to Charlemagne. In 806, he still had 3 male sons alive, and he made plans for dividing up his empire among those 3 sons. None of them was to get the imperial title. If all 3 had survived to 814, there very well may have been a civil war at that point among those 3 sons, but 2 of them died before 814, leaving only one, Louis the Pious, to inherit everything. And as a result, this particular succession went very smoothly. The Carolingians were fortunate in that they had not torn themselves apart in civil wars the way the Merovingians had done, because they had a knack for leaving behind just 1 or at most 2 male heirs. This luck runs out during the time of Louis the Pious, however, because Louis the Pious leaves behind several male children at the time of his death in 840, and these children do not get along very well at all. By his first wife, whose name was Ermengarde, Louis the Pious had 3 male sons. The oldest was named Lothar, the middle son was named Pepin, sometimes called Pippin, and the youngest son was Louis the German. Already in 817, which is just 3 years after he had become the king of the Franks and had taken over from his deceased father, Louis the Pious made plans for what should happen after his own death. Louis the Pious was not an old man in 817. He's only about 40 years old, and he could reasonably have expected to live another 15 to 20 years, having made it out of a very perilous childhood and adolescence. Why he decides at a relatively young age to think about the problem of succession might be related to the fact that in 817, part of the palace at Aachen collapsed on him and his wife, nearly killing them both, and this may have made him aware of the fact that he could die at any time, and that he should think about the future, even though he could expect to live another decade or 2. The plan that Louis the Pious drew up in 817 was called the Ordinatio Imperii. And according to the Ordinatio, Louis the Pious designated the oldest son, Lothar, to get the imperial title after Louis the Pious died. In addition to getting the imperial title, Lothar was to get most of the Carolingian lands. The 2 younger children, Pepin, the middle child, and Louis the German, the youngest, are each to get a relatively small kingdom. Pepin is to get the kingdom of Aquitaine, located in the far southwest of France, and Louis the German is to get Bavaria in south-central Germany. Lothar is designated as the overlord of the other 2 children. They have to meet with him once a year as a sign of the fact that they accept him as their overlord, and they are to obey Lothar in matters of diplomacy and warfare. The Ordinatio was an attempt to reconcile the seemingly contradictory principles of empire, which has to be one unitary whole, and Frankish inheritance practices, which required you to divide up your property among your various sons. There's to be one empire, but there will be 3 kingdoms, and the the two younger children are going to have to obey their older brother. There are several problems with the Ordinatio. One problem is that the younger sons did not get very much, and there was every reason to expect that, like Merovingians before them, the Carolingians, Louis the German, and Pepin were going to revolt against Lothar and try and gain more territory for themselves. The other problem is that by attempting to settle the question of succession so early in his reign, Louis the Pious inadvertently paralyzed the Carolingian government because everyone became focused on the issue of the conflicts between Lothar and his two younger brothers. The situation was going to grow even more complicated because Ermengarde died in 818. And within 4 months, Louis the Pious married a woman by the name of Judith. And Louis the Pious was not done producing male heirs. In 823, Judith gave birth to a male child, a boy known later as Charles the Bald. Most babies were bald even then. The situation got very sticky because Judith wanted Louis the Pious to provide something for Charles the Bald, to carve out some territory that Charles the Bald gets to inherit when Louis the Pious dies. The three children of Ermengarde do not want to give up anything to Charles the Bald, and they dislike their stepmother Judith intensely, and Louis the Pious finds himself caught in the struggle between his three children by Ermengarde and his new wife Judith and her son Charles the Bald. The result is a fierce and a complicated rivalry that paralyzes the Carolingian government still further. And paralysis was not something the Carolingians could really afford in the 830s and the 840s as the Viking attacks became more and more serious. Indeed, there's some reason to believe that the Vikings were aware of what was going on in the Carolingian Empire and decided to escalate their attacks in the 830s and 840s precisely because they knew the Carolingians were focused on the problem of succession. Egging on the three children of Ermengarde and Judith and Charles the Bald were Frankish aristocrats who were eager to foment civil war. The Franks had not expanded at the expense of their neighbors since 804. Even during Charlemagne's lifetime, the Franks had stopped making new conquests. It had now been about 2 or 3 decades since the Carolingians had added any territory to their empire. They had not been able to distribute new lands to their followers because there were no conquests to distribute. And Frankish aristocrats were starting to get itchy. They wanted to receive new lands. They wanted to try and profit from their military skills, but they weren't getting much opportunity to do so. If civil war was to break out among the various Carolingians, however, the aristocrats would have the opportunity to fight and to take property from the vanquished, even though the vanquished would in this case be fellow Franks. At the very least, you could expect that Frankish aristocrats, as in the days of the Merovingians, would be able to drive hard bargains with the various Carolingian rulers. You would withhold your support of Lothar or of Pepin, of Judith and Charles the Bald, waiting for a very nice offer of lands and monasteries and, their right to mint money, perhaps. Something that made it worth your while to fight on one side or the other. There would be no shortage of volunteers once civil war broke out within the Carolingian dynasty. And the stage had been set for a series of rebellions. However, it was not simply a straightforward struggle between the children of Ermengarde on the one hand and Judith and Charles the Bald on the other hand, because relations between Lothar, who was supposed to be emperor under the terms of the Ordinatio, and his two younger brothers were also quite strained. They were jealous of the fact that they were allotted only small kingdoms. So as a result, you have a very fluid situation in which the two younger brothers of Lothar might switch sides, siding against Lothar at certain times, siding with Lothar at others, depending on the given situation. Trouble broke out in 829 when Louis the Pious actually gives some territory to Charles the Bald. Louis the Pious did not explicitly state that Charles the Bald should inherit this territory after the death of Louis the Pious. It seems to have been a temporary gift in an attempt to maintain domestic harmony and get Judith off his back, frankly. But the other three children saw this as a bad development. If he's already starting to give him property, perhaps later Judith will wheedle him into making this a permanent grant that he gets to inherit. We are stepping on a slippery slope here that we need to reverse. Therefore, the three children revolt against Louis the Pious. Certainly, Lothar and Pepin, the middle child, are in on the initial revolt, and it seems likely that Louis the German was in on it as well. In 830, Pepin takes the Carolingian army and marches against his father. He accuses Judith of adultery and shuts her up in a monastery. Lothar appears on the scene and decides that his father should be sent to a monastery as well. And as a result, Louis the Pious finds himself imprisoned by his own sons. Lothar also, in 830, puts the Ordinatio Imperii into effect, the division that Louis the Pious himself had drawn up, and he puts it into effect because it made no provisions at all for Charles the Bald, who is shut out entirely. Louis the German gets Bavaria, Pepin gets Aquitaine in the southwest of France. Events took a strange turn shortly thereafter, however, because Louis the German and Pepin became disgruntled with the high-handedness of their older brother and with the puniness of their territories vis-a-vis his, and so they decided on their own to double-cross Lothar and to set their father free, to let him out of the monastery in the hope and expectation that Louis the Pious, out of gratitude for his liberation, would then increase the portion that had been allotted to them under the terms of the Ordinatio Imperii. So in 831, they free Louis the Pious, and Louis the Pious is caught in a difficult situation because his sons have rebelled against him, but two of them at least set him free. Judith is also freed at this time and wants him to make provisions for Charles the Bald. And like any good overwhelmed father would do, he simply did nothing. He undoes the institution of the Ordinatio in 830, and we return to the status quo ante, but he doesn't punish his sons because he does not feel as if he's in a position to do so. And so the whole issue of what is going to happen to the Carolingian Empire is unresolved. I'm sure you've heard the saying that history never repeats. I wish that were true. A new rebellion breaks out in 833. The three children of Ermengarde become angry with Louis the Pious. Louis the Pious had confiscated Aquitaine temporarily. And so they hatch a plot against their father in which they lead the army against Louis the Pious, arrest him, throw him in a monastery for a second time. Louis the Pious remains in captivity for 10 months. However, the two younger children of Ermengarde decided to double-cross their oldest brother once again. If it didn't work the first time, maybe it'll work the second time. And they release Louis the Pious from the monastery, once again in the hope that they will be rewarded by having their portions increased in size. Louis the Pious in 834 emerges from his monastery, but he's as bewildered as ever by events and decides neither to punish Lothar for this act nor reward the other two children for setting him free. Up to this point, little blood had been shed. It's simply a question of tossing dad into a monastery every couple of years. However, as Louis the Pious got older and older, the situation grew more tense, and the likelihood of an actual civil war breaking out rose. Louis the Pious thought he had found a way out of his predicament when Pepin died in 838. Louis the Pious was relieved, in a sense, because he could give Pepin's kingdom of Aquitaine to Charles the Bald. And therefore, Charles the Bald will now inherit something, but Lothar and Louis the German will not lose anything. He thinks he's found a solution to make everyone happy, but not everyone is happy. Not everyone is happy because Pepin had a male child. And Pepin's brothers claimed that the male child, not Charles the Bald, should inherit the kingdom of Aquitaine. As a result, when Louis the Pious died in 840, the Carolingian Empire was primed for a civil war. With their father dead, the three surviving sons of Louis the Pious could finally duke it out with one another. Lothar moved first against Charles the Bald, who had indeed gotten Aquitaine. And Charles the Bald decided to try to forge an alliance with Louis the German, even though Louis the German was Charles the Bald's half-brother, but Lothar's full brother and occasional co-conspirator. He claims, though, that if Lothar succeeds in defeating Charles the Bald, then he will not hesitate to attack Louis the German, his own flesh and blood, and take away Bavaria from him, that the only opportunity for Louis the German to hold on to his inheritance is to ally with his half-brother against his blood brother. And Louis the German bought the argument, and so Louis the German and Charles the Bald joined forces against Emperor Lothar. The two sides meet in battle at a place called Fontenoy in 841, and the result was a very bloody stalemate. Neither side truly defeats the other, but the stalemate favored Louis the German and Charles the Bald because they are simply trying to hold on to what they already have, and Lothar needed to eject them from their kingdoms. Contemporaries were horrified by the Battle of Fontenoy because so many Franks had died at the hands of other Franks. In 842, Charles the Bald and Louis the German met personally and cemented their alliance by swearing oaths of loyalty to one another at Strasbourg. The oaths of Strasbourg were written down, and they are remarkable documents because they constitute some of the oldest documents we have in Old French and Old German. The Civil War came to an end finally in 843, as Lothar, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald came to an agreement known as the Treaty of Verdun. The Treaty of Verdun, the birth certificate of Europe, divided the Carolingian Empire into roughly 3 equal parts. The westernmost part, or West Francia, goes to Charles the Bald. There's a middle kingdom, or the kingdom of Lotharingia, which goes to Emperor Lothar. And the easternmost part of the Carolingian world, or East Francia, goes to Louis the German. Louis the German and Charles the Bald do very well out of the Treaty of Verdun. This was more territory than they had had at the beginning of the Civil War. Lothar has lost out. And the political divisions of the Treaty of Verdun roughly correspond to modern France and modern Germany, with a middle region that is partly German, part French, in which West Francia and East Francia will fight over for the next 1100 years. Another important implication of the Treaty of Verdun concerned the imperial title and the whole concept of empire. Louis the Pious had intended Emperor Lothar to be the overlord of his younger brothers and half-brother. Under the terms of the Treaty of Verdun, however, the Emperor Lothar has no control over the King of West Francia or the King of East Francia. They do not have to meet with him periodically. He has no right to travel through their lands without permission. The imperial title was now an empty personal honorific that conveyed no jurisdictional power to the emperor. It is still a prestigious title, but it's not one that actually changes anything in reality. Europe was going to consist for the next 1,000 years and more, not as a single unified empire with one ruler, but as a set of independent kingdoms that would eventually become independent nation-states. Because there are 3 different Frankish kingdoms created by the Treaty of Verdun, the subsequent history of the Carolingian world becomes very complicated, but suffice it to say that the number of kingdoms kept changing over time because sometimes a ruler would die and subdivide his kingdom. Sometimes the ruler of one kingdom would conquer some of the others. For example, Lothar dies in 855 and the Middle Kingdom is divided up. Indeed, West Francia and East Francia go to war with one another in 858 as they try and carve out pieces of the Middle Kingdom for themselves. And relations between West Francia and East Francia, the various Carolingian kingdoms that spring up after 843, were often hostile. And this was something that contemporaries were very depressed about, because the Viking raids are severe during the 850s and 860s and 870s, but the rulers of these various Carolingian kingdoms spend most of their time attacking one another, not defending their subjects against the Vikings, and this will help to discredit the Carolingian dynasty. Amazingly enough, the rulers of these various kingdoms also fight over the imperial title very often, even though it was an empty title that did not convey overlordship over anyone else. For one brief period, contemporaries thought that the Carolingian dynasty might have gotten its act together again and would be able to restore the Carolingian Empire to its former glories. It just so happened that in the early 880s, a large number of Carolingian rulers died in quick succession throughout Europe, leaving Europe almost bereft of Carolingian rulers. However, there was one left. In 884, a West Frankish king died, and he left behind a 5-year-old heir who would later be known as Charles the Simple. The aristocracy and clergy of West Francia did not want a minority at this point in time, did not want to make Charles the Simple the new ruler, because the Viking attacks are coming each and every year. And so they decided to give the crown of West Francia to the ruler of East Francia, who at this time held the imperial title. His name was Emperor Charles the Fat. And so in 884, Charles the Fat becomes emperor and ruler of all the territories that had once belonged to Charlemagne himself. And contemporaries hope, and in some cases genuinely believe, that now that the Carolingian Empire has been reunited under a single emperor, the Carolingians are going to be able to do something about the Vikings and their attacks. High hopes were placed in Charles the Fat. In 885, the Vikings besieged Paris, giving Charles the Fat his first major test. Paris was defended by a local count by the name of Odo. And Odo decided to hold out against the Vikings rather than paying protection money. And as Paris begins to run out of food, he manages to sneak out of the town, and he travels to Charles the Fat and begs him to come to Paris and relieve the town and end the Viking siege of Paris. Charles the Fat assures Count Odo that he will come with the Carolingian army to do something about this, and Odo rides back to Paris, fights his way back into the town, and informs the inhabitants that they should hold out because Charles the Fat is coming to save all of us. Charles the Fat did come, but it took him several months to arrive. And when he finally did arrive, in October of 886, instead of attacking the Vikings, he pays them Donegeld and asks them to leave Paris alone, and allows them to travel further inland to attack the region of Burgundy and even to winter there. We could have paid him off. The inhabitants of Paris are horrified. We held out for how many months so that you bribed them to go away? Charles the Fat did not look very good after the encounter at Paris, and contemporaries soon began to lose faith in him and in the Carolingians more generally. In fairness to Charles the Fat, he seems to have suffered from some sort of nervous disorder. He had a nervous breakdown in 887. He had paralyzing and frequent headaches, and in an attempt to cure his migraines by cutting an incision into his skull to relieve the pressure was less than successful. Even worse than the hole in his head, though, was the fact that Charles the Fat had no male heirs. Not only is he ineffective, if he dies while he's still our ruler, there is going to be a civil war because the whole of the empire is going to be up for grabs. And so in 887, a group of Frankish aristocrats band together and depose Charles the Fat, who dies only 1 year later. The last hopes in the Carolingian dynasty die with him. In conclusion, the Carolingian Empire disintegrates during the 9th century. discredited by its inability to deal with the Vikings and discredited by the civil wars fought by various of its members, the Carolingian dynasty soon developed a rather bad reputation within the empire. The empire itself splits up into various independent kingdoms under the terms of the Treaty of Verdun in 843, and so badly discredited is the Carolingian dynasty that in both West Francia and in East Francia, the Carolingian dynasty is done away with once and for all, and new dynasties emerge. The Capetians in West Francia, which will become the Kingdom of France, and the Ottonians in East Francia, which is going to become the Kingdom of Germany, as we'll see in our next lecture.